Good evening. Thanks so much for joining us on this beautiful night. I know it's hard to force yourselves to come inside when the weather has finally turned on our side, but we're happy to see all of you here tonight. My name's Alex Klein. I'm the Dorothy and Stephen R. Weber Curator here at ICA. And while I have a captive audience, I'd like to make a few announcements of upcoming programs here this next week. On Saturday, May 6th, we have our next Gather with Laos in the House. And it's going to be a pop-up dinner on the outdoor terrace that's focusing on the Lao New Year and Lao New Year traditions, including Lao cuisine and sharing stories of Lao refugees. So the Gather events are really not to be missed, so please come, 6 p.m. And then on Sunday, May 7th at 2 p.m., we're going to have our next coffee and conversation event with Penn PhD candidate Hillary Whitman, which will take a closer look at Chris Marker's virtual Second Life film, Ouvroir the Movie, which is on view in Myths of the Marble in our first floor galleries. And then on Wednesday, May 10th at 6:30 p.m., we have our program that's organized in conjunction with Charlotte Ickey's exhibition, Ginny Casey and Jesse Reeves. And the program is called On the Domestic Exhibition, a conversation between architectural historian Esther Costa de Meyer, who did the fabulous Pierre Chareau show that was up at the Jewish Museum just a few months ago, and Felix Buricher, who's the editor of Pinup Magazine. If you haven't been writing all of these dates down in your notebook, just sign our email list and you'll be kept abreast of all of our events and exhibitions. So just briefly, this is our final public program in our series I is for Institute, an initiative that I've been co-organizing with my colleague G. Wesley. And it's our year-long investigation that asks what's in a name and thinks critically about how language becomes a kind of architecture. And so we've been thinking back into what does the word institute mean in our history, what does it mean now, and what could it mean in the future? And so as part of this, we've had a lot of research and behind-the-scenes conversations, but we've felt really strongly that we've wanted to bring some of these discussions into public view and bring our community into the conversation along with us. And so as part of that, we've been collaborating with different colleagues and institutions internationally who are thinking critically about what an institution is. And one of these wonderful collaborators is Koyo Kouoh from RAW Material Company, and we're just thrilled to have her here tonight. And so in addition to my wonderful colleagues here at ICA who've helped make these events possible, I also really need to thank the Pew Center for Arts and Heritage who support these kinds of discovery initiatives that don't even have a clear outcome necessarily. And within the curatorial field, this is such a privilege to have these kinds of opportunities to take risks and experiment and to enter into dialogue with our peers. So Koyo has many accomplishments, too many to mention right now, but I will say a little bit about her biography. She's the founding artistic director of RAW Material Company, about which she's going to be presenting tonight. RAW Material Company is a center for art, knowledge, and society in Dakar, Senegal, as well as the founder of RAW Académie, which is an experimental school for artistic thought and curatorial inquiry, whose current session leader is Chimurenga Library, and we're very excited to be joining them in Senegal in a couple of weeks. In addition to overseeing a sustained theoretical exhibition and residency program at RAW, she maintains a critical curatorial advisory and judging activity internationally. In addition to her work with RAW, she also recently was appointed the artistic director of Fabrica de Sabao, an art and innovation initiative in Luanda, Angola, and she's also the curator of 154 Contemporary African Art Fair in London and New York. Many of you will probably be traveling up to New York this weekend to check out the program, and there's a wonderful forum of discussions that she's organized, some of which include members of the ICA family, such as Sandra Perry, who has a new work on view here at ICA, so these are not to be missed. I've long admired Koyo's curatorial work from afar and in person. Some of her many exhibitions have included the Precarious Imaging, Visibility Surrounding African Queerness, which was at RAW Material Company in 2014, Still the Barbarians, which was Ireland's Biennial in Limerick in 2016. She's also served as an agent within the Documenta 12 and Documenta 13 exhibitions, and she's the editor of Word, Issa Samb, and the Undecipherable Form. which the exhibition I had the opportunity to see at OCA in Oslo, and it was phenomenal, and I highly recommend the publication. Among her other publications, I should mention Condition Report on Building Art Institutions in Africa, a collection of essays resulting from the eponymous symposium held in Dakar in January 2012. And she's currently working with Rasha Salti on Saving Bruce Lee, African and Arab Cinema in the Era of Soviet Cultural Diplomacy, a research and publication project to be held across different institutions in late 2017 and 2018. So this is just a small snapshot of the many different roles that Koyo occupies and her different research interests. So with that, please join me in giving Koyo a very warm welcome to ICA.
Hello, thank you, Alex. It's always a burden to speak after someone saying so many good things about you. Then you have to live up to that. Thank you very much, and thank you to ICA, and thank you to Alex, Mary, G, and the entire staff for having me here. It's a real pleasure to be in Philadelphia. I was here, now I figured it out, it was like 17 years ago. That is long, long time. And I'm seeing in the audience someone that brought me here. Louis is here, look at it, wow. So, it's a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Alex, for inviting Raw Material Company to be part of what I think a very essential discussion about institutions, institution building, internationalism, collaboration, and knowledge production and knowledge sharing. I'm a horrible IT idiot, so what I'll be saying and doesn't necessarily match with what you will be. So sometimes I just leave it at this, so you have a very exciting one slideshow. So, but I'll try to do better. I will be talking about the the contemporary landscape of arts institution in Africa in general, with a particular focus later on raw material companies. So you will, I apologize for reading a little bit because I'm not such a wonderful performer in terms of presenting. So this representation will work to consider the contextualization of institution building in African artistic environments through the various trajectories of independent art spaces that have emerged on the continent since the 1990s. Does everyone hear me properly? Back, also in the back, good. In general, but in particular, the genesis of Raw Material Company within that context. So herein, I journey back to the intellectual and political premises at the root of these initiatives to think about how art centers, exhibition producers, artists and thinkers at large work and often battle with issues of autonomy, solidarity, and criticality. Rather than quantifying the lack of effective national or public programs available for the support, representation, and preservation of such structures, I will look to independent commitments and collective apparatuses where the conditions for production and dissemination are both highly self-organized and linked to a flow of progressive ideas and practices. So, since the mid-1990s, the field of visual arts has rapidly undergone internationalization. Certain words just don't want to come out of my mouth. Internationalization is one of those. Good. Which has has to a large extent followed the geopolitical routes of increased deterritorialization of markets, education, and the production of knowledge. While in the West, there has been a concurrent flow of government as well as philanthropic funds in aid of international exchange in this field, such generosity is largely goes at miss in African cultural policies. This reality is inherently gives rise to questions surrounding the non-existence of transnational visions for cultural and artistic production, and the extent to which a lack of public funding undermines this activity and has a direct impact on the representation and validation of artistic and intellectual practice. Contemporary artistic practice is strongly linked to the notion of being international, and with this carries an unspoken prerequisite. Being contemporary means operating within a given range of aesthetic, political, and discursive languages. This globalism brings to the fore practices and behaviors as well as international protagonists who, by wielding an ease of mobility and intellectual skillfulness, are able to transmute cultures into cultural products, ready for consumption by an international audience. In Africa, the majority of cultural institutions, such as museums and art galleries, archives, and art academies, have been established either by the former colonial state or in the context of post-colonial nation building after the liberation movements of the 1950s through to the 1960s that led to a series of independencies in the early 1960s. As a consequence, the cultural field has often been shaped according to national aesthetics and ideological concepts and policies. Under what may appear to be a rather inhibited condition that many artists, intellectuals, and thinkers have repeatedly criticized and distanced themselves from, particularly in relation to state-initiated cultural politics. Across the last 2 decades and increasingly in the last 10 years, a whole host of new spaces and initiatives have been formed. While the wording of mission statements may vary from space to space and from place to place, many of these independent spaces share a common ground. Having responded to a cultural urgency and the need to address an institutional and artistic and critical void. What this urgency necessitates are more platforms for multifaceted production. As art centers in the West are threatened by closure and even effectively forced to close due to the spiraling strain of budget cuts and aggressive policies towards the arts, such as in the US currently, elsewhere, more and more spaces are establishing themselves, in Asia and in Africa particularly. And if things go smoothly in terms of what I may be considered, and I predict that a form of political and social transformation will occur, it seems that the Western art world will soon be subsumed into a much larger global force as a wave of new artistic elite takes shape. It seems clear different canons, economies, and dialectics, and most importantly, a highly informed audience is emerging. So what I want to convey here is that the ecosystems of art institutions in many African countries, and I want to really speak in a larger kind of context, because one of our very first critical research was exactly about that. I will get to talk about raw material company later, but raw material company is really an outspring of this context, of this theoretical and analytical, historical context. This trend is especially apparent in Africa, where a variety of independent and/or private art initiatives have recently been established by way of filling the void left by state-initiated cultural and artistic programs and their empty promises. These initiatives set themselves apart from state-affiliated institutions, as well as from commercial art markets, by creating alternative models and platforms for negotiating art and history, and by reflecting upon archiving art, visual culture, and cultural history. The birth of private cultural spaces and institutions in Africa in the 1990s came as a result of several factors. The most commonly cited is the lack of national institutional structures able to host projects and conduct convincing debates around the contemporary experience. However, I will insist here that by owing the emergence of private spaces to the negligence of African states will be to reduce those initiatives to a mere mechanical reaction that did not follow from independent or original thought. Although funding for medium or long-term artistic and institutional projections is practically non-existent throughout Africa, such as subsidies granted by international organizations at the same time, which is a kind of, compensating the lack of public and corporate or philanthropic funding. The international funding organizations also are not given with the proviso that art institutions have to work towards the idea of development, which we at RAW totally reject. We are not interested in this kind of development. So, I would argue, though, that this factor fails to suffice as a direct causality, meaning the factor that we exist because the public institutions are not there. So, the different issues surrounding our survival. Indeed, while independent spaces such as Douala Art in Douala opened in 1991, and I like to mention Douala Art always because I respect the African genealogy of the elder, and Douala Art is one of the first ever independent space that was established in Africa with critical and engaging program, and in Cameroon, it's just by coincidence that it's in Cameroon. No chauvinism from my side. So while independent spaces such as Douala Art in Douala opened in 1991, pioneered this concept in an environment that could only be described at the time as ravaged, spaces of similar nature have also been established in a place like South Africa, where academic, commercial, and governmental structures are already in place. So in this case, a comparison can be drawn with Europe and the US, where a number of alternative spaces have risen to the force in the 1980s, where these new spaces an attempt at satisfying the dream of autonomy. Most accountable is that these spaces were driven by a desire to distribute and disseminate an ideology through a mechanism wherein independent direction and programming could be separated from nationalistic ideologies and public bureaucracies. In the short history of these spaces, there has also been a focus on collectivity and sharing, which has played a significant role in terms of their proliferation. Sharing an ideal, sharing knowledge, sharing experience, while shattering hierarchical system that reserves art for the preserve of the elite. Where social divide between educated citizens and others remains a familiar and widespread issue, on the African continent, this divide is all the more stark. Thus, the challenge that these professionals decidedly latched onto was to democratize culture and make it accessible to all. Bombarding ourselves with reflexive questions surely demands a certain strength and a course of action on which to proceed. Quite possibly, before we commence with the next logistical step, that is a disentanglement from systemic cultural organization, we must first discuss the means available for moving beyond cultural borders. Primarily, there seems to be a prevailing contradiction between these spaces. I rather call them institutions, but we can discuss about it later. And the sites of establishment, which at once we can address. In most cases, the public-private dialectic is exacerbated by the fact that these organizations are often located on the margins of public cultural establishments. When I say the margins, is that, as I referred earlier, that, and this applies very particularly to Francophone, former French colonies in Africa, is that there is a tradition inherited forcibly from French colonial experience, is that the state is omnipresent. The state organizes everything. The Ministry of Culture, the Minister of Culture is an omnipowerful official in the cultural landscape. So there is this culture of having state initiatives that many of them are absolutely, valid, valuable, and even strong. But the fact that they are so steered by the government prevents them from a level of freedom of action and of thought that created a critical void in a sense. And also, that's one level. And the other level is the fact that those institutions and and events are very much embedded in the idea of making an event, whereas the daily practice and intellectual output, the education that we think needs to be dealt with on a continuous way outside the framework of events is not taken care of. I was digressing too much. Computer went off. Okay, where was I? So in most cases, the public-private dialectics is exacerbated by the fact that these organizations are often located at the margins of public cultural establishments. So the notions of public and private always appears inherently conflictual, to the extent that while the latter aims to deal with a sphere of intimacy and operates on the basis of proximity, the former caters to state ideologies, and as a result, frequently limit the freedom of the other, if only through its regulatory function. Operating on proximity, as independent art spaces often do, means knowing our audience intimately. Since we rely on a sense of collectivity and collaboration, while the anonymous tools set in place technocratically by the state frequently do not live up to the audience expectations. Hence, an inevitable cavity opens out, which often leads to a misappropriation and mismanagement of public facilities and financial resources. In such an immense undertaking, well, I can give many examples here. I mean, Senegal, for instance, is one of the most fabulously structured, organized country culturally in West Africa. I mean, we had the luck, we had Senegal. So, but at the same time, even this incredible infrastructure that Senegal established throughout the country, you have regional art centers, you have the National Gallery, you have the Museum of Art, you have we had the amazing festival that morphed into a biennial, one of the most important biennial on the continent. But at the same time, there is always this kind of discrepancy between the content and the means in relation to the means that are appropriated to those events and institutions and what they really do. So that's our fight within public and private constantly. Because we say you have everything, you have the money, you have the facilities, you have the space, and you don't do anything. So due to this proximity, independent art spaces are able to no, that was not there. So hence an inevitable cavity opens out, which often leads, exactly what I was meaning, to a misappropriation and mismanagement of public facilities and financial resources. In such an immense undertaking of reappropriating public space, it is vital that art centers have a thorough understanding of their audience, since their founders are also their leading consumers. Due to this proximity, independent art spaces are able to problem solve and address issues by approaching a collective body that is actively engaged in the space. There is no intermediary between funder and consumer, as, to an extent, there is little difference between the two. I'll get to it a little bit later, actually right now, because to cite the example of Raw Material Company, for the first 2 years, 50% of the budget of the organization came out of my own pocket. And ideologically, Raw Material Company was born out of the necessity to create a space for knowledge sharing. The core motivation, now I can give you a new slide. Yeah, some action. So, and ideologically, Raw Material Company was born out of necessity to create a space for knowledge sharing. The core motivation was to establish a space for alternative education and learning. Since RAW would fail to maintain its operation if I were to retract my partial funding, I'm doomed to continue funding the institution myself. All the while, I insist on transparency and advocate the importance of art institutions as critical sites of experimentation and freedom. We are de facto an experiment, and I believe that our true significance will only take shape once we enter into an operative symbiosis with our environment. We seek to grasp a changing reality by holding up a mirror to citizenship and engaging with the local audience. This creates a form of reactivity, a particular sensitivity to the worlds around us, whose shape is transformed by our presence. The I, or more exactly the consciousness, does not only allow projection, it also encourages introspection. This double prism necessarily refers to the concepts of space and perception. Further, founding directors of art centers in Africa are rare spaces. Like Janus, the Greek god, they cannot be satisfied with a single unequivocal representation. The self-evident facts that we attempt to highlight are necessarily manifold and even contradictory, since we are permanently open to the movements of the world and the changes in our own environments. What we present as obvious fact is not intended as a definition, since we are aware of the impossibility of presenting ourselves to the world through a distinct identity. There is more action coming. So, yeah. Now I will talk to you. This was to sort of set the ground, the intellectual, political, historical ground on how we were established and why and in which kind of conditions and so on, and what we do. Now I'll get to a little bit more of the details of how we do it. Art training in Africa has been part and parcel of a carefully elaborated system of transmission of skills and construction of visual power ever since we began to produce objects, forms, aesthetics, and imaginaries. The absence of art schools in the Western academic tradition does not mean that there were no concepts of aesthetics and knowledge production and transmission. It only means that these things have very different cosmologies and creative epistemologies. However, formal artistic pedagogy, as it is understood in the West, began more than 100 years ago, either as part of nationalist program of cultural development or as ancillary component of colonial education. In the wake of political independence by the mid-20th century, new African states vigorously pursued autonomous national or cultural programs, including the establishment of new art cultural institutions or expansion and orientation of existing colonial ones. However, we had something in the 80s that sort of descended on us, called structural adjustment programs. So the structural adjustment programs, basically, for those of you who are not familiar with what structural adjustment programs were, for many, I would say, I like to put it in the context of non-Western geographies, because they were mainly applied in Africa and in Asia. So the structural adjustment programs were, the Bretton Woods institution will devise, I will put it in a very simplistic way, will devise what national priorities will be. And those national priorities were always against education, culture, and so on, because all the national resources would be subjected, funding would be subjected to resources being allocated to what is called the productive sector, so economy, liberalism, and so on, basically selling out your country. So when the structural adjustment program descended on us in the 1980s, they severely impacted culture and educational industries. In the ensuing turn to the so-called productive sectors of the devastated economies, art education, for the most part, witnessed dramatic decline in quality, scale, and ambition. Here comes another show. So alternative modes of artistic education and production did, however, emerge. For example, Laboratoire Agitar, Tank, workshops, and setsetals, very much established by late Issa Samb, who just passed away a week ago. These are independent models, non-state-oriented models of artistic education that were established to counter the lack of state kind of vision in terms of artistic education. So where does RAW position ourselves? This is our beautiful facade in Dakar. Where do we position ourselves in that context? We don't offer a diploma. We are not a school. You don't come to us to learn any particular skills, but you come to us to learn how to think, and to think through your practice, and to think through your relationship to your environment, and to think through your role as a creative mind, as an artist, as a political body, basically. So what do we do? RAW is a self-reflexive institution that operates around 7 main pillars of activity: exploring and intervening in the relationship between art, knowledge, and society. So we started by, in our inception almost 10 years ago, in 2008, we started by doing a very broad, now I would say traditional and classical exhibition program. So this is a selection of the projects that we did. Whereas showing art, not necessarily enough in the Dakar environment, we needed to delve into the critical field around it. So exhibition making, I'm a curator, is part of our DNA somehow. Another pillar of our activities is publication. One of my mentors once told me, because when I was younger, I was doing a lot of things all the time in the same field. And I was so, excited and activated by what I was doing, I always forgot to document. And he once told me, Koyo, you publish or you perish. So, and when we started RAW, I remembered that very clearly. So that's one of the reasons, but also the fact that we are very invested in contributing to a critical mass of intellectual and theoretical production about what we do. And I am a publication junkie and a book junkie. So this is just a selection to the, come on, Dee, to the left? No, left is this. No, left is this. Okay. To the left, you see one of the publications that I am particularly proud of. It's the, to date, the only seminal thorough monography of the practice of Issa Samb. And in the middle, you have an idea library, which was actually our very first publication. That was a kind of a game that I played with colleagues around the world, asking them, when we were putting together the space, asking them what would be the most important thing that the library should have, because one of the core elements of establishing RAW was to provide a library for research, for students, for critics, for journalists, for whoever is interested. And we have, I think, one of the only critical library specialized in contemporary art in West Africa, next to what BC Silva is also doing in Nigeria. But in Dakar, we are absolutely the only one. And so we did a publication on that, which is the Idea Library. And the publication on the right is a publication we did in 2012, which was chronicling our political turmoil that went through the country, and that was concomitant and was with the what people call Arab Spring, which is African Spring, but digression again. But what I want to say is that we had a president that wanted to stay too long in power, and we said no. And it took a year to kick him out of office, and throughout the whole process, we had a lot of riots, we have a lot of demonstration, and photographers were working very hard on that, and we curated a wonderful publication about that, and we kicked him out. So, one of the, as I said earlier, the core establishment of RAW was providing a space for people to engage critically and theoretically with artistic practice and intellectual thought on artistic practice, on society, on knowledge. So this is a view of our library. The gentleman over there is one of the most important historians of the Dakar University, is Professor Boubacar Bari, who visits us regularly. Another part of our program, which doesn't really get to be noticed internationally as opposed to our international programs, is our weekly discussion about society through the arts. We have like twice a week presentations and conversations around all sorts of topics about our society, about politics, about art in politics, politics in art, thinkers. And we have, I mean, a cross-section of professionals from economy to science to, you know, a whole range of people who come and discuss issues pertaining to our life. Another program that we run are the symposia. The symposia are a concentrated moment for us to discuss very important topics pertaining to our existence. So the first symposium, I mentioned it earlier, was in 2012, and it was centered around the emerging new landscape of artistic institutions in Africa, the relationship to public and private, and also the relationship to international collaboration, the programmatic orientations, funding or not funding, you know, and how sustainable are we or are we not, you know, towards international donor agencies. So these are sort of the things that we do. And after doing all of that for a few years, we realized that something was missing. Something was missing in the sense that the exhibition as a format, the publication as a format, the discursive program as a format were not responding to the kind of imperatives, intellectual and artistic imperatives that we wanted to address. That, or at least I may reframe it, or that we are not getting to the mark. Do you say that in English? What is in the bone? The marrow, yeah. That we are not getting to the marrow of the things. So, and somehow we created what some of our colleagues worldwide applauded us for. We created what we called an institutional sabbatical. We closed shop for 10 months. We stopped our programs. We said we have to think. We cannot get into this mill of doing, and not reflecting about what we are doing, not thinking through what we are doing, what kind of impact is it having? Is that impact progressive, interesting, is it transforming something? Is it even needed, you know? Because we, cultural and art people, we are so pretentious, we think that everybody wants us, you know? So, which is not always the case. So we went into introspection to think that through. And during that time, we really went through all the different programs that we did in the past, and we realized that there is something that we are good at. We are good at almost everything, but still. There is something that we are good at, is really forming spaces of, knowledge production and knowledge sharing. And how can we bring that space into a more programmatic kind of body into the various things that we do at the organization? That's one level. The other level was also that we realized that over the course of the years, we had so many young professionals, young artists, young students, young journalists, young writers, young, wannabe curators, who will come at us with requests, with seeking for advice, seeking for direction, seeking counseling, and so on, that somehow we could not professionally accommodate. So it became so apparent, and also that we thought that the exhibition format is a limitation, even the publication is a limitation, and we wanted to take this a little bit further. So that's what became the Academy. And the Academy is a space where that is really directed to what we consider a very vulnerable group of people, young graduates from art schools, from various curatorial programs, from various departments of humanities, from, you know, these sort of academic training where you are trained, but as soon as you graduate, you have to unlearn everything that you learn. And we help them unlearn all that through the academy. And we, the academy is, we do 2 sessions a year. Each session is for 8 weeks, and there is the session October to December and April to June. And the first academy, it's organized around elite faculty that we invite, that sort of devise the conceptual and intellectual framework that the fellows will be working on. And we accept up to 10 fellows, and from a diversity of backgrounds, so artists, curators, critics, and producers who come together to work on the conceptual framework that the lead faculty has devised. So there are also guest faculty coming in over the course of the 8 weeks. So the first session, it's a very brand new program. We are just into the second session now. The first session, Hunger Incorporated, was directed by Rasha Salti. Rasha is a colleague and an amazing researcher and a film curator and critic and independent writer, specialized, of course, if we want to attach geography, Middle East, Arab world. And her session was around the political and artistic imaginaries and how do they overlap. And the next session, and that's like a classic situation of an academy. Here you see guest faculty Newton Aduaka, an amazing Nigerian filmmaker, in conversation with the fellows, one-on-one conversations with faculty and fellows in developing the programs, because the fellows have to apply with a project. So they are selected also based on their project. One of our particularities is that we are thoroughly international, and we don't make a distinction between Africa or not Africa, whereas of course we make sure that half of the program is made or given to African professionals, but people come virtually from everywhere. This is a classic situation also, because as much as the academy is about furthering the conceptual and intellectual framework of the fellows, it's also furthering the faculty's research. This was a session with Issa Samb in his studio in Dakar, and yeah, this is the end of the session where fellows present work, make presentations and contributions, performances, and so on. And at the end, some of them say nice things like this. The second session, which is on now, is curated by Chimurenga. Chimurenga is an independent platform for art, politics, and writing, based in South Africa, Pan-African by nature. And the session is really around how do we produce knowledge. It's really centered about knowledge. How do we produce knowledge? How do we learn what we know? And how do we unlearn what we don't know? How do we know that we don't know? It's all about things like that. And and it is very much based on the philosophy of Fela Ramson Kuti that really has established an aesthetic and sensitive, sensorial framework of being and thinking. So music as a thinking system, and society as a blanket or landscape for navigation. So, yeah, this is it. Thank you for your attention. And if you have, I think I'll open it up to questions now. I mean, for those of you who would want to know more, there is a lot of stuff on our website. It's just rawmaterialcompany.org, and our Facebook, Raw Material Company. We are Instagram junkies, so you can follow us on Instagram. Our Instagram is rawgram2011. I don't have the slide for that. I'm not a good promoter. My staff will kill me. So, yeah, thank you. I don't want to bore you any longer.
This is something we've talked about before, but you didn't mention in your talk. I wondered, this is actually a very basic question, but can you talk a little bit about the name, Raw Material Company? And
that's where I should have started.
No,
That's
it's okay. It's a great
about.
place for us to actually maybe start a discussion.
It's good. It's a very good question, and it's a recurrent question, and I have many forms to answer it. So I have to think of which one I will apply here today. Well, I mentioned earlier that the last 10 years have seen a proliferation of, art institutions being established in different places on the continent. And we wanted to be different. We wanted to not different in terms of standing out, but different in terms of content. And that content the thinking should go all the way to the naming. And culturally, names are very important. So the thinking that went to finding the appropriate name for our organization was all the dons first. We didn't want to have anything Africa around it. We didn't want to have anything art in it. We didn't want to have anything center in it. It's a byline, but it's not in the name. We didn't want to have, contemporary in it. We didn't, all these done. So we started crossing all of that, and then you stand there with kind of very little, It's all because you can't call it Center for Contemporary at Dakar or Institute of Contemporary at whatever. So what do? You have to think further. But at the same time, we wanted the name to reflect all of that. So it became somehow. And we also wanted the name to be in an African language in a part of it. So the deconstruction of Raw Material Company, sorry, can you help me? Is basically, I just want this one. I did something wrong. It became apparent I have to say for me, because I was the only one doing that thinking, it became apparent that raw material came at some point, because raw material as to refer to Africa as the provider for raw materials for international industry, okay? We are the hotbed for raw materials for the world. So raw material refers to that. But also, raw material ticks off the Africa box, so it gets to Africa. So, but also, art as raw material for human development and for social development, for, you know, and company. First, because we think that we are cultural entrepreneurs. So we establish a company, but most important, company refers to togetherness, refers to collaboration, refers to, you know, exchange, refers to kinship, refers to peers. So, and now to the African language, RAW in Wolof means, it's very pretentious, I hate to say all that, but RAW means first, or pioneer, or, you know. So you have the old deconstruction of raw material company. Yes.
Okay. Sorry, my name is Steve. I'm from South Africa, but I teach at Wharton School. I teach finance. So, and I'm just grateful. Koyo, right? Yeah, I'm just grateful seeing you here. I mean, I'm just so much disenchanted with such an amazing, transcendent African culture, mostly as far as artwork is concerned, with Americans they're not familiar with. Even most of Europeans are not familiar with. So I don't know really, Ross, I want just to know, you know, how you propagate. Do you have any method so far that you can propagate this artwork so it can be able to penetrate in Europe or the United States? Do you have any other means that you can be able to make sure that the Americans are familiar and they can be able to know that there's something ideal that is going on outside America? There's that creativity that can be harnessed in the world of artwork. This is just a question that I'm asking.
Well, thank you for your question. I was mentored by someone who always told me, those people who don't know about you don't need to know. And you don't have to justify yourself to anyone. You don't have to present yourself. So somehow, our work is not to disseminate African creativity per se as such. Our work is not centered around the promotion of African artists. Our work is about the fibers and elements of artistic and intellectual practice in itself, no matter where and no matter which sort of connections, collaborations we establish. We are interested in the intellectual experience of making art and the magic of making art. So, of course, we come from a background that still needs, unfortunately, some sort of advocacy, some sort of, defense even, some sort of promotion. But it is not, I think that we are not those who would want to do it. And because there are other institutions and people who do it very well, And at the same time, while I'm saying this, I curate a fair in London and in New York, and next, very soon in Marrakesh. So these are extensions, and I have an international curatorial practice working with institutions around the world, basically concentrating my whole curatorial practice on showing and working with artists from Africa and the wider African diaspora. So I think that I cover it through that. But in the context of RAW, we really want to get into the dissection of what artistic practice and intellectual practice is.
Hi, my name is Jorge Gutierrez. I'm a curator from Miami that relocated to Philadelphia. I used to run the Global Caribbean Art Basel program. I have a question. In a globalized post-colonial world where there's no more one or two centers, but many centers, how your component of knowledge links to important events like the Dakar Biennial, who in one of the last editions, they explained that they were concentrating only on African artists because they felt that before being global and incorporating artists from everywhere minimized the presence of African artists. Obviously, one issue here, like he was saying, is the knowledge of what African art means in contemporary context. How does RAW relate to those events that do promote and project the African contemporary expression? Thank you.
Well, as I mentioned, we are very tightly related to 154. We are part of the initiators of that fair, and I curate the conversation program there. But to respond directly to you, the Dakar Biennial is very dear to us. And we work, I mean, personally, I've worked on many capacities with the Dakar Biennial, except for curating it since 2000. So I think that it is, the biennial in itself has a very important role within the landscape of contemporary art from Africa and its diaspora. And just to tell you, the biennial is not only focused on African artists, it's African and African diaspora. So African American, Cuban, Brazil, the entire African diaspora you just have to prove that you're somehow of African descent, and you can be and be a good artist, of course, and you can be accepted, and you can apply. So that's and I was part of those in the early 90s who contributed to these criteria, because somehow it was important to establish a strong platform where artists from Africa and the African diaspora could have a space to present their work, discuss their work, meet, where they are like the kings and the queens, you know, and not just tokens somewhere interjected in, you know what I mean. So, and I think that criteria is still some sort of valid, globalization here or not. And I think that it is absolutely, it has brought, since 1919 that the biennial exists, it has established a very strong connection, a very strong relationship with the participating artists. I mean, for even the most, how do you say, established artists, African artists like Yinka Shonibare or others, coming to Dakar is like, wow, So that means something for a lot of African artists. So, And I think that these events do a lot in that disseminations that both of you are addressing somehow. But this is what I really, it's one thing to have events like structuring events like the Biennial, and it's another thing to have institutions like Raw Material Company. One does not exclude the other. In the contrary, it's very complementary. While the Biennial is a wonderful event, every 2 years, everybody's happy, we get there, everybody comes, we have a beautiful show, we have wonderful parties, and and after a month it's over. So then what do? You go back to sleep and wait for 2 years? No, you have to continue working.
Thank you. This is just incredibly exciting to hear about. And I was fortunate to visit Dakar in 2002, but it was for dance classes and workshops. And I guess my question is, since I haven't really seen what the art that's produced at Raw Material resembles, but I work at Fabric Workshop and Museum, and there's been a lot of international artists come and done residencies there. This seems more like artists who are in a more emerging stage of career. And so I'm curious, my imagination of what the work looks like is that it's very conceptual, and that the media is maybe less important than the ideas behind that work and how the artists are influenced by the environment, their community interaction in Dakar. And so I'm sort of curious about the de-skilling or the just shedding of the art baggage that you referred to, and how they come away with a new aspect of their art production.
Ah, very good question. Makes me think. Yeah, I mentioned earlier, fellows don't come to us to learn how to make art. They went through that already, so to speak. And we don't necessarily make art or objects, and of course that happens also, but it's not like a prerequisite, or it's not like expected. It's not like, we provide a space for thinking about your work through the work of faculties, for instance, that are kind of like a bridge towards what you're doing yourself. And I have to say that yes, we are very much interested in process-oriented artistic practices and dematerialized practices, yes. Ephemerals, yes. Film, of course, absolutely fundamental. Image-based, motion image-based work. So the fellows who come to us are really there to also experience and be in connection with the thinking of the faculty. Because it's really about what the faculty provide to them. It's also really about the practice of the faculty that is there. So it's very much towards that, but of course, since they have to apply with a project, and that their project has to be in response to the theoretical framework offered for a given session, there is work done on their project. So they don't leave with a set of tools to know how to do their work, but they leave with like a theoretical, analytical research fix that we give them, or framework that we give them for them to continue developing their work, you know. So, which I think is something extremely valuable and fundamental to give to young professionals. And it's for free.
My name is Taji Nall. I'm art practitioner here in Philadelphia. And RAW Material as a think tank. I've been fortunate to not come through institution in terms of my practice. I come from the other side as an entrepreneur. And now that I have thrown my hat into the ring as a practitioner, I always hear this dialogue from other artists who come through institutions, come through academia, and especially the young artists that I've been fortunate enough to work with, that how do you do it, Taji? How do you execute so much? It's like this breadth of work that has happened within a 5-year time frame, and it's looked like you've been working, practicing as a practitioner all your life. And it's because of this, I'm old, I'm 55, and I've seen a lot and I've done a lot and I've always been around art. And as a curator, as a gallery owner, et cetera, I've seen all those workings. And out of not wanting to go into academia, out of many circumstances, that I was always self-motivated. So the idea of education was always, you know, number one. You know, I'm like a research hog. So to show that RAW Material is exactly what I'm seeing right now here in Philadelphia, with these young artists looking for something outside of academia to unlearn what they learned. Everything you said, it was like, I'm living this. I hear all these young artists, and they come to me and it's Taji, it's like, how do you do it? And then how can we get to where you are? It's like, you have to unlearn. And in that, you can unleash what's in you. And it takes time. So I want to commend you, because we need a RAW Material here. And I've been fortunate enough, I pulled together a collective called Two Spiral. And in the midst of Two Spiral, those things are happening. This idea of being able to bounce concepts and ideas, you know, off of each other. You know, I've just fortunate was commissioned to do something with the Philadelphia parks. And in that, as soon as I got the commission, the first thing I do is, oh, I'm not familiar with this area. Find out information about the area, dig and research about the area, the concepts that grew the area. Then after I did that, now I go to my peers, and I'm in their ears and they're in my ears. Oh, Taji, well, what about this idea? You can throw this in there. And that has to happen more.
I commend you back. That was not the question.
But maybe that's a wonderful note to end on, this idea. Maybe that's a wonderful note to end on, that we need a raw material. Oh, sorry. Okay, final question, because Koyo has a train to catch.
What's vital to me about this is that it seems to me that, I'm trying to get the words for it, but it seems to me that when you talk about democratizing the conceptual, and that the fact that you've remained nimble and reflection as part of how it is that you discover what the next step will be is really the important thing here. I won't ask about this self-funding because that's always a question here. That's the first question out of people's minds. How do you sustain this? But for me, the real question is gathering an opportunity for people to enter the question of art, not as a matter of making, but a matter of doing or even being. And that's really the question, because we're all sort of obsessed with this notion of how it is we'll get to the point of this impulse to making something that justifies the time, or the endeavor, or the authority to take yourself out of the line and do something and then put it back in front of other people's eyes. But this seems to emphasize this notion of art as a matter of doing that's intrinsic to just being human. And I'm very jealous of your 10 fellows, because when I was beginning to Google, how do I get there? Because it seems to, no really, it seems to me that that's an incredible distinction between what we're fed about what it means to be a person in the midst of art and what it means to justify the activity. And you just sort of collapse that whole thing in the middle of this compound and just brings people together. And the concept that you choose from one season to the other all comes from that. So if there's a question about how do you export that, the question is not how do you export what you're doing, but this relocate this notion of art as doing and being as opposed to making. And that's something I really hope you get that past customs, because we're all like really, we're sort of like champing at the bit. And there are people, I mean, it runs through all our institutional conversations. How is it that you get it past this product understanding so that you understand it as something intrinsic? In a certain way, something that you're authorized to because you're human, and then you can identify it in all sorts of ways that will bring people together in different environments to do the same thing and know that it is art as they're doing it. So think about that and get back to us, please.
Thank you so much. That's very endearing what you said. It's, yeah. Well, let me be practical. You can apply for the next session. You can apply, and the call will be out soon. And the next session will be directed by a very good and smart artist collective called Journal Rappé, which are coming from the hip-hop generation of the late 80s that emerged in Africa, and particularly in Senegal. So it will be about hip-hop culture and blackness. And so you're welcome to apply. I lost my mentor very recently, and he taught me a lot of things. And one of the things that he taught me is that art is a state of mind. It's not necessarily about making it. It's about thinking through it. It's about living it, and it's about disseminating it. So, and this is where it all grants on for us. And this is why we work with very young professionals to instill that in them before they get exposed to all sorts of, stuff that they will anyway get exposed to, but at least they will remember that they went through something that taught them something else. So this is what we are trying to do. We are trying to save people.